Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Luke Hanna. Now, this is a treat. I've been loving your media. You're one of my favorite people, evidence-based nutrition. And you've got a master's in obesity and clinical nutrition
Yeah.
and a degree in sports and exercise science. And I love people who have that duality of their educational background. So it's great to have you on.
Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right, diving right in. The new food pyramid in the US. It's getting a lot of attention, a lot of controversy. And anybody listening knows that I don't touch political things. So I would like to look at this through the lens of a nonpartisan, evidence-based thing as opposed to most people tend to come at. I certainly think this one is a lot of people come at it from political tribalism. I would like to dispense with that. And let's start with what did they get wrong?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. First of which, it seems that the guidelines are sort of more muddied and less clear than they were previously. Even if you just look at the imagery that they're using, if you look at what we had or you guys had previously from my plate to the pyramid, I think when you work with people, you understand how important it is to make things very, very simple. And especially when you're talking to the general public and you're not even working with them on a one-to-one basis, you need to make it as simple as possible. And I think that's something that my plate did very well. I think there were some conflicting messages that actually didn't even necessarily reflect that imagery as well. So, as an
Mm.
example, there was a big shift from they're trying to basically promote more meat and animal products, which is reflected in the way that it's presented in the pyramid. But if you actually look at the guidelines, certain aspects, for example, continuing to recommend the limitation of saturated fats to 10% of total energy intake, which is in line with the previous guidelines, which I actually think is a good recommendation and in line with what the literature says. It's kind of confusing because on one hand they're saying increase your intake of these foods that are higher in saturated fats, but then also limit them. And I've actually seen a few people online, I won't name names, but a few sort of proponents of the guidelines and promoters of this movement using examples saying, look, it's actually very possible to follow this sort of way of eating and limit your intake of saturated fats, but then they're sort of intentionally using low fat dairy products, etc., which they actually do encourage you to consume in the written parts of the guidelines as well. So I think it's actually going to be very difficult for people to follow those recommendations, and that's just making it way more confusing for people.
What did they get right? We'll bring this all together, but let's start
Sure.
with now, what did they get right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of similarly, I suppose. I think that aiming to increase the protein recommendations to 1.6 to, sorry, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilo body weight is quite a good move. I would say that most people I wouldn't necessarily say there's a protein deficiency problem in the US, but I think that we all know the benefits of increasing your protein intake, especially if you are someone who's trying to improve your body composition or lose weight. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but of course, it does depend on what types of protein sources you are focusing on because you don't just get the protein from these foods, as I just touched on. If you're going to be increasing your animal intake of animal products, you might be getting other things you might want to limit. But I do think that that was a a positive. I think the other problem I think is that there are things that are things areas that I agree upon, but those areas are actually not that different from the previous guidelines. So I
Mm.
think that that's a lot of people like myself who have a bit of an issue with people cheering for this, saying, "Oh, look, but they're telling us to focus on more whole foods, less ultra processed foods, etc." Absolutely agree. We should be minimizing those things, but we were also already that was already part of the guidelines. They were already telling people to limit refined and added sugars and focus on more nutrient dense foods and things like that. So I think continuing on from that is a good idea and common sense almost.
And I could sense the hesitation in your words, and we'll talk about the misrepresentation of the comparison in a second.
Mm.
But do you also feel like, because again, it's hard to separate the political discussion from
Mhm.
this, and I think most of the discussion around it has been politically partisan.
Mhm.
Do you find it's difficult to actually publicly agree with the parts that are actually valid, for fear that someone will come at you because almost everybody has looked at this through a tribal political lens?
Personally, no. I'm
But do
more
you
than
think
happy
some
to say I
people,
think.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sure some people, but I think one of the reasons that, I mean, I have spoken about this on my own channel, and people are saying, well, you're just saying this because of who's promoting it and stuff, and they're doing good things. I'm like, but why are we cheering and making such a big deal for common sense
Mm,
and for basic things to be done well? So it's not like people are, are sort of against the idea of eating more whole foods, etc. It's the fact that they are cheering this like it's something new while also actively worsening other areas which will do harm if people follow them, which we can discuss in a bit, which would
mm.
actually not have positive effects. I think that's the problem, but I don't think you speak to anybody. I actually, maybe it's just because the circles I'm in, but I actually think that a lot of the videos or content I've seen on this, people have tried to give credit where it's due, but it's quite hard because it's almost like, why are we giving credit for things that were already recommended anyway? It's not some revelation to focus on nutrient dense foods and all this sort of stuff. So I think that's the problem.
And so let's go there. You mentioned my plate,
Mm.
and a lot of the, let's call it the branding and the messaging around this from the administration, it's presenting this as if it's a dramatic reversal over the old pyramid. Now, I think there's two problems to that, and I'll let you run with them. One is the old pyramid guide hasn't technically been in use in quite a long time. And two, they've actually kept a lot of the good things about the old pyramid. So, do you want to talk about the misrepresentation compared to the old pyramid?
Yeah, I think that this is the other thing as well. When I spoke about it, people were saying, well, you didn't criticize the old pyramids. And it's like, okay, well, they might not have been perfect, but they also haven't been actively in place for decades, like literally decades. So why would we talk about it now? But I think there also were two versions. One, the original one definitely could have been improved upon, and then we had the second version, and then there was even another version, and then we went to my plate. But I think it's the idea as well, and I keep hearing certain people from the administration say, oh, the pyramid with Fruit Loops at the top of the pyramid, and it's like that never happened. I know what they're getting it confused with. They're getting it confused with I forget the name of it now. It was a couple of years ago. It's just Food Compass, which was
Mm,
never actually published as guidelines, and it was sort of misinterpreted. And people were, I won't go into it, but they're confusing it with something else. But I think it's quite intentional. I don't think these people
mm.
are necessarily stupid. I think that the messaging is intentional, and we have data from the CDC to show that three-quarters of the US population didn't even know what the my plate was. So when they're sort of talking about the old pyramid and sharing videos of South Park joking about flipping upside down, it's because most Americans think that that's been in place. Probably, maybe not in our circles or the people we work with who have a bit more of an
Mm.
interest. People listening to us have a bit more of an interest in nutrition and public health, but the average person had no clue, let alone tried to follow it. It was something like 8% of the population had even attempted to follow it, let alone succeeded as well. So I do think that there is some intentional messaging and saying that, we've been told that we need to be eating all Fruit Loops, etc., when actually most of the messaging has been pretty sensible for quite a long time.
I'll interrupt this episode for a quick but important side quest. While I don't think everybody needs to track nutrition all the time, tracking is one of the most powerful tools to make sure you're not eating too much or too little. And Macros First is my go-to app for me and my clients. Macros First has a free barcode scanner, and a premium version comes with a bunch of cool stuff to make managing your nutrition easier. Like, one, AI search. AI is everywhere now, where you can speak or type the foods you wish to save and log everything without having to search for each individual ingredient. Two, import recipes from a website. Save time creating recipes manually by importing all ingredients and instructions from your favorite recipe websites. No more searching for each ingredient one by one, just paste in the website. And three, this one's a big one for nutrition coaches. Follow unlimited friends so you can follow all your clients. And there's a lot more cool features. You can try the premium version of Macros First free for 14 days Just download Macros First from the App Store, and during setup, you'll be asked, how did you hear about us? Type in the code Andrew.
Why don't people follow the guidelines? Because you've established this. Like a lot of this stuff, for all the media, all of the hoopla around it, people, these food pyramids, these guides actually are minimally influential at best. And I think a lot of this stuff is absolutely posturing and virtue signaling to look great. Look at this revolutionary thing we've done. Will this new pyramid actually change behavior?
I don't think so. And in a way, something that used to be quite depressing is probably actually quite good now. Because you know what I mean? Like previously, it's like, okay, well, actually, we do have a lot of data. For example, we have data showing that if people follow the Eat Well guide, which is what we have in the UK, if people follow that, they actually, if they go from a sort of average Western diet to follow that, then they do see quite significant improvements in health outcomes and longevity, etc. And it was quite depressing that we couldn't get anybody to follow it. But now it's sort of maybe shifting towards something that might not be the most optimal dietary pattern. It's like, well, do you know what? The fact that people probably won't follow this is maybe a good thing. But yeah, I think that you can talk about all of this all you want. And while I think that, for example, the previous guidelines were actually pretty spot on with what the literature says we should be doing to try to be healthy and live long. Our food environment and our government, it's just not, they're not doing enough essentially to help people do that. If you put people in an environment where they're constantly having to fight themselves and advertising and marketing, you think about the kind of money these companies are spending, billions on marketing. They know where to place something on a shelf to get you to buy what they want, which will probably be Coke or full sugar sodas or these sorts of things. And I don't think there's any sort of, again, another narrative that is often promoted as, big food trying to make you ill. They just want to make money and they don't necessarily care about your health. And I think anyone sensible would agree with that. But if the environment continues to stay the way that it is, then we can continue to have these problems.
We talked earlier about some of the inconsistencies in the message, so I definitely want to circle back to that. And you talked about the saturated fat, and I can't remember. I think it was some press conference. Maybe people are just clipping out things, and it's like I can't remember the exact language. I don't like misrepresenting things, but it felt to me like, oh, we're ending the war on saturated fat. But as you said earlier, the actual guidelines said that they still recommend limiting saturated fat to 10% or less of your daily calories, is it, I believe?
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
so what are the other misrepresentations or inconsistencies within the way that it's being presented forward facing
Mhm.
versus what the guidelines are saying? And perhaps even we could talk about the alcohol stuff too, because I know there was
Mhm.
a bit of buzz about, Dr. Mehmet Oz was getting up on stage and people are losing their shit because he said, quote, alcohol is a social lubricant. Now, there's obviously some context to what he was saying. So do you want to tackle any of that?
Sure, yeah, of course. Yeah, there's multiple things there. So from the alcohol perspective, and as we were joking about before we started, if you're watching this, I've got a whiskey on the shelves behind me. I like to have a drink on the weekends. I like beer, I like whiskey. So but I think I'm not like, sort of personally against drinking. That's everyone has their level of risk they're willing to accept. But I think that anyone who works in the health space should and must know how harmful even small amounts of alcohol can be. So, where they are loosening the guidelines for alcohol consumption, where they had quite specific recommendations previously, trying to limit to 1 to 2 drinks per day, or something like that, to sort of make it more vague and then come out and talk about how, as you say, alcohol is a social lubricant, which is like I go out and I drink with friends, and that's not necessarily wrong, but it doesn't mean that it's not still a net negative. And I certainly don't think the government should be coming out and giving people any excuse to drink more when it is one of the most harmful things that we consume and one of the most harmful things to society. So I find that quite odd, where they're sort of saying, yeah, you should limit them, but also we're going to make it less clear how much you should really be drinking, and then come out on stage and talk about potential other benefits, which seems quite odd, I think.
What do you, I mean, this is probably speculation, and I don't know that we have data to suggest this, but is there I think this is one of the arguments that detractors will say. who's got their hooks in the people making these decisions? Corporate interests, money, that sort of stuff. Is that a concern here with the alcohol, with the mixed messaging around saturated fat and therefore animal food source?
I think I don't know specifically with the alcohol side of things, but certainly I think it's more of an issue from the promotion of animal products, etc., and that side of things. And I do think, and I mentioned this in a video the other day, I do find it quite ironic given they are a group who has continually complained and brought up issues about funding and bias in the previous guidelines. But if you actually look at who's been funding a lot of the key players in formulating these guidelines, almost all of them have ties to the beef and dairy industry, have
Mm.
received funding, and many of them are what I would say is questionable characters who have a bit of a social media following and are advocates of certain diets and maybe a little bit more pro low carb, etc., and have actual books and products themselves that they would benefit from, the promotion of these ideas. And I don't think, again, it's something I've talked about a lot. I don't think that funding automatically means that something is wrong. But when that funding seems to influence guidelines and those guidelines don't seem to be aligning with what the evidence says, then it's a red flag. And I do think that the main thing I was trying to point out was that it's this whole confirmation bias thing, right? Where it's like big pharma, agriculture, it's all been influencing the guidelines, but then we have these really clear, obvious ties that are likely influencing these decisions. I think, you've got to at least be consistent with your arguments.
So the person listening, and they're trying to figure out, okay, should I be following this food guide? Does this matter to me in my life? Maybe to the coach who's trying to figure out, okay, is there any utility in this? What do you say to that person? Where do you want them to go?
I think there's nothing wrong with looking at the previous guidelines. I think they were pretty solid, or even the UK's were very similar. Our current guidelines are pretty good. I think, and again, this to clarify, I'm not vegan or vegetarian or have like a an anti-meat bias, but it's trying to objectively look at the literature, and critically appraise that and understand whether these guidelines are in line with that or not. And I think for the most part, again, you will probably get a lot of health benefits just from trying to focus on minimally processed foods, whole foods, getting enough protein, making sure that you're getting plenty of fruits and veg and things like that. And again, in their sort of written guidelines, they do suggest multiple servings of fruits and veg and things like that. So I think that, if someone is predominantly eating fibrous fruits and vegetables, if they want to include animal products, that's fine. If they don't want to, they don't have to. But if you're going to include animal products, predominantly focus on leaner cuts and poultry and also fish, oily fish and things like that a couple times per week. If you want to include grains, then that's also fine. But obviously you want to be focusing on whole grains more so than refined grains. And I think most people know this stuff, right? And this is going back to, like, we've known for a long time these dietary patterns are things that will be health promoting, but actually getting people to follow them is very difficult. And another reason that I think that going against the grain, pardon the pun, with a lot of the messaging they have, it's more novel, it's interesting, and everyone loves to think that there's some sort of big boogeyman telling us to do things that are intentionally making us ill. So I think if people actually adhered to the basics that they probably know they should be doing, they would be fine. And I do think that most of the guidelines in this one are, as I say, like getting a good amount of protein, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilo, and then making sure you're focusing on predominantly whole foods. You will go far, but it doesn't mean it's sort of ideal, I don't think, with their current recommendations.
This might be uncharitable, but is this whole, coming out with a new pyramid, a spectacle, a performative media stunt, to get the usual clapping seals to say, hey, look at us, look what a great job we're doing. You're nodding yes, so I think your body language
I think so.
betrays.
I think so. I mean, it would be in line with a lot of other things that they've been doing, where they're saying, oh well, we're swapping beef tallow,
Mhm.
seed oils for beef tallow in fries, and getting companies to remove artificial dyes or using cane sugar or whatever it is for coke, like these things that are actually not really. First of all, a lot of it, a lot of time it's these companies saying they're going to do these things, especially with like the food dyes. A lot of the time, there's not actual laws in place forcing them to do this. They're just saying this because then they know they're going to get media attention. And while they're doing these things that, let's say that let's, be charitable and say, okay, look, if they did these things, it's probably good. It's for the net positive. Is this really where should be focusing our energy when other actions and things that are being implemented, cutting, making healthy food less accessible,
Mm.
loosening regulations for pollutants, for if that go into our water and soil and all these sorts of things. Are those, is there going to be like a net positive from all of this? I think you have to look at what people are saying and then look at their actual actions.
Mm.
And are there sort of certain aspects that are very performative, as you say, to get everyone clapping like seals? But
Mm.
what are they actually doing? And that's all I'm asking people to do. And if I think that even if, again, I always get, you get people saying, oh, you just, you're lefty or whatever it is. It's like, well, no, if the other side was doing this, the criticisms would be exactly the
Mm.
same.
If you could say, dictate policy, what would you turn around and say, okay, if you made this the policy focus, this would actually make a meaningful top-down change to, because again, the food pyramid, the US, I mean, yes, culturally, I'm Canadian, we are influenced by a lot of the media and culture coming out of the US. The UK, maybe
Mhm.
perhaps to a degree, but yes, it is a little bit American centric, but even still, from a policy thing, I mean, most of the Western countries we're talking about still have the same problems.
Mhm.
So yeah, policy wise, top down, what would you love to see us change, work on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if we've completely figured these things out, and that's the problem. And I think it's going to take a lot of time and energy to figure those things out. But I think if we can make it easier for people to access nutritious foods, addressing things like food deserts, providing meals for children that are also going to be nutritious,
Hmm.
um, I think improving accessibility and walkability in cities. Obviously,
Hmm.
that's more of a problem in the US specifically. In the UK, it's not so bad. We do have that problem in some areas. Those sorts of things. And kind of addressing maybe social determinants of health more as well. I mean, one of the biggest predictors of health is, where you're born and what your
Hmm.
socioeconomic status is. So if we can try to level those things and make it more of a level playing field, so to speak, I think that would be putting us and we'd be going in the right direction. And this is the funny thing, right? It's similar. It's actually similar goals for the most part. We want people moving more. We want them eating more healthy foods and all this kind of thing. So, but I'm not a health policy expert, so
Fair.
that would be my opinion.
And again, what I'll sometimes point out about my guests is there's no bombast here. There's no absolutism. There's nuance, which doesn't play as well. This is not going to make for a good clip for the Diary of a CEO podcast, the type of guests that usually end up on there. Yes, I'm throwing shade. Uh, yeah, don't go there for your average health, you know, information. Okay, so semi-related, but you had a post about the things that you used to believe. And I like watching how people change this stuff. And we already talked about saturated fat, but if you want to go deeper, you used to believe that saturated fat and high LDL cholesterol didn't matter for your health outcomes. So perhaps why did you once believe this, and what is the evidence now saying?
Hmm. I think I like talking about this one and actually just the subject in general because I have gone through the whole arc. I've gone through maybe the parts of the Dunning-Kruger scale.
Hmm.
When you first you're first learning about nutrition, there's a lot of misinformation, or maybe even there are certain things or courses that I did were actually very, like early on in my career, that were actually very good, but certain angles were maybe not quite as correct as I now know them to be. So I think yeah, I mean I've gone through the whole. You learn the basics, you learn about saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, and it's quite basic stuff, right? It's been around for a very long time, since the 50s or 60s. It was popularized by Ansel Keys, the idea of the lipid hypothesis, and then you start to learn a bit more, and you start to read studies, but maybe your skills for critically appraising literature is not where
Mm,
I think it is,
mm.
which I think is huge. And even now, despite doing multiple degrees, still there are so many people I learn from in the space, and I'm still trying to learn and get better at this. So, 10 years ago when I'm like, oh, do you know what? This meta-analysis shows that saturated fat is not harmful. But you're only maybe looking at it on surface level. You don't really know how to deep dive into it. And for example, I used to believe that it didn't matter as long as you were getting adequate fiber, or it didn't matter. What mattered really was particle size because you have different sizes, which I won't get into detail. But there were various different things that I was like, oh, do you know what? That makes sense. And from credible people as well, whose now stances I think have also changed. But then you start to get a bit better at identifying maybe which studies are better or worse, or what the problems. Like some of the very common studies that people cite, not to go too deep into the weeds, but for example, one common issue is, let's say that you have two groups of people and one group is consuming around 3% of their total energy intake from saturated fats and the other is consuming 5 or 6% of their total energy intake from saturated fats. And you say, well, look, these people, there's no difference between these groups. So
Mm.
saturated fat doesn't do anything, but they're both below the threshold of where we start to see problems. So that's a very common thing within the research that people often cite. So I think it's just being more aware of that and being able to identify what the common trends are actually showing. And I've been through that with many different things. And that's why it makes me laugh when people say, I literally had someone comment on a similar video, like literally today, being like, oh, this is outdated. You need to update your knowledge. I'm like, bro, I've been through this. I've gone from where you are and I've gone to the other side. Hopefully one day I can help people understand and get to that as well. But yeah, I guess that's kind of my stance on it.
Do you want to give it a little bit more context as to what has actually changed about, let's do the cholesterol side of stuff, because I think we're pretty good on the saturated fat now.
Yeah. Well, I think basically the idea that, yeah, LDL cholesterol, certain foods, particularly those high in saturated fats, can increase your LDL cholesterol levels, which then is one of the drivers of cardiovascular disease. Um, and I just think we have more and more literature coming out, and even funnily enough, and again, sorry, going back to the fact that people will say, well, this is outdated, just because the idea was popularized 80 years ago or whatever it was, doesn't mean we haven't got more research, hundreds of studies coming out over decades and decades. And even I replied to someone, I think it was that same person I was just mentioning, and they were saying, outdated. I was like, well, will you change your mind if I cite you 3 studies published this year or last year? I know they won't, but I did it anyway because I'm petty. But and it's like, for example, one of the studies I actually quite like talking about is I don't know if you've spoken about the Keto CTA study on here
No, I don't believe
with
so.
Nick Norwitz, etc.
No, I don't tend to get too granular
Okay.
myself. Occasionally, a guest may go
Okay.
reference something deeper, but please share.
Okay, so basically, there was a study that was published last year by some they're definitely more sort of on the pro keto carnivore side.
Mm.
The idea being they took a group of people who are known as lean mass hyperresponders, people who have very high LDL cholesterol, despite being otherwise metabolically healthy, blood pressure, insulin sensitivity, all good. And they put them through the study, and then at the end they came out and they said, look, this is proof these people had high LDL but then no effects. And then some people started digging into it, and we realized they were trying to basically misrepresent the data, and they had actually changed. So when you publish studies, normally you would submit, I'm losing the term now, I'm just having a brain fart, but normally you will have a manuscript you submit early to say what you're looking at. Essentially, what they published was different from what their primary outcome was. And they did that because the data basically wasn't showing what they want. And actually, it showed was that the participants had a very aggressive increase in plaque buildup, essentially.
Mm.
And so it's actually quite a good argument, because that's another thing that I hear all the time is that, well, you can, as long as you are healthy and you're lean, etc., this doesn't matter. But actually, if we look at this data, we do see that they had progression that was akin or worse to people who are metabolically unhealthy, with type 2 diabetes, etc. So there are these sort of more isolated studies, and yeah, I'd say do take maybe a bit of joy in citing that because it went specifically against what they wanted to show, I suppose. But yeah, I think we just have quite a lot of good data, and not just people. I think also think that it is all just based on observational or epi research, which is looking at large groups over time, and obviously it's much harder to control for certain variables. Not impossible, you can adjust to a point by just adjusting for confounding variables, but we have many different lines of converging evidence from Mendelian randomization studies, RCTs, epi research, hundreds of studies showing that the more the sort of the more you increase your exposure to LDL cholesterol, the higher your risk. And again, there's always nuance, right? Whenever we're talking about this, it doesn't guarantee. It's like if you drink every day, it doesn't guarantee you're going to have problems. You can smoke. There are people who smoke and live to 100. There are no guarantees. There are exceptions. But with the nutrition, it's always looking at what will increase or decrease your risk, and then I think deciding on what you personally want to accept. So you can still do things that maybe you enjoy that might not be perfectly healthy for you. I still eat red meat. I just bought sausages to have for dinner. I still drink alcohol, as I say. So it's just the context. It depends on the context, how often you're consuming them, how much you're consuming, and what sort of your personal risk tolerance is, I suppose.
I might be misinterpreting the way you explained it, but let me break this down. So let's say someone wants to construct a study to prove a point that this certain thing that we have evidence to suggest is bad, like LDL cholesterol, but you self-select participants that actually have, let's go, like a lot of healthy user bias. So they do all of the other shit really well in an attempt to then prove, look, this one thing isn't a big deal, but it's a blatant misrepresentation of the greater population because the average person is really metabolically unhealthy. So you can't extrapolate the fact
Mm.
that someone who does all this shit really well, but they actually have this one factor based
Mm.
on, some sort of dietary thing. Is that what happened there?
No, so I think they were trying to say this doesn't matter because everything is. I get what you're saying. So it's
Hmm.
kind of double-edged, right? And I think this is also actually um quite interesting because people often say, well, we need everything controlled. We need a randomized control
Mm,
trial. Every single habit is
mm.
controlled for. They're told to do specific things, but that's actually not how it always pans out in real life, right? So I think it's very useful to try to narrow down, understand what might be causal, etc., etc. But it's a good point because, as you say, most people are not actually free of those other risk factors as well, which also can contribute to the development of chronic disease. But I think it is useful to do, and I think actually it was an interesting study to do because it does help us narrow that down and understand, okay, without these other things, are we still going to see these negative side effects? And essentially, we did see that. We saw that, as I say, rapid plaque progression. And generally, it was only, I believe, I would have to look at it again, but I believe it was only 12 months or around a year. So you really shouldn't be seeing like significant progression in that time frame because it is something that happens over the longer term. And that's also the other thing is that people can say, well, I've been doing this diet for this amount of time. I've seen no ill health effects. And first of all, you can't feel plaque progressing in your arteries until it's too late. But the other thing, it does take time. So yeah, I think that. Yeah, so I don't know if I waffled too much. I forgot what your original
Wow.
question was, but yeah,
No,
they were trying to show that. So I think it's double-edged. I think you can understand that actually this doesn't mean that for the average American, for example, the average person who is not in a metabolically healthy state. It's not actually representative anyway, but even if you are someone who is metabolically healthy in every other aspect, it doesn't mitigate those risks entirely.
and it totally makes sense how the way you explain it. It's like, yeah, if you get these effects showing up in people who are doing everything right, how fucking catastrophic is it for someone who's doing most things poorly?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's the thing as well that we talk about this a lot, and I think it's one of those things that is spoken about a lot because there is a lot of pushback against it. It's the same thing with seed oils. I actually saw a funny, I think it was like a tweet from Andrew Tate. I think it's the only time I've ever agreed with the guy, but he was literally like, "Shut the fuck up about fucking seed oils. No one fucking cared." And it's like, I actually never spoke about it until a couple of years ago because now we have so much misinformation about it that we
Mm.
have to talk about it. If people were just sort of on board and like understood it properly, we wouldn't need to talk about it all the time. But then, for example, with like cardiovascular disease and LDL cholesterol, we talk about it because there's so much information and it is a really strong risk factor. It doesn't mean it's the only one. No one is saying that. It doesn't mean that these other factors don't matter.
And if anybody wants a like masterclass in seed oils, I had Danny Lennon on recently.
Mhm.
He's brilliant, and
Yeah.
we actually just tore that apart to go into what the evidence said about it. So, definitely got one or two comments on social media, people who are very like tribally, ideologically against the idea, and that was entertaining, but
With all
all
these
good.
topics, you will do. I'm sure there will be some about this as well. You
Mm.
sometimes not going to be able to change people's minds, no matter how logical. I think that's also an idea that I was dissuaded of very early on after posting on social media. Is that it doesn't matter how logical you think your argument is. It doesn't matter how much evidence you provide. Some people don't want to have their minds changed, and we all have biases. None of us are, perfect. But yeah, some are more open than others, I guess.
Cognitive dissonance is a very powerful thing in our
Mhm.
brains. Okay, uh, you'd be a good person to explain this one. Does more exercise, either strength training or cardio, consistently increase appetite and cause people to fully compensate for the burned calories by eating them back?
Yeah, so I think short answer, no.
Okay.
I will go into a bit, but I think that what you always need to consider with these sorts of questions is you can you can dig into the weeds or you can talk about mechanisms all you want, but what you want to actually look at is outcome data, testing what happens when people actually follow these habits. And I don't know how much you've spoken about this before, and exercise is the does not do a ton for weight loss specifically. It has a ton of benefits for body composition, metabolism, health, and also there's a lot of research showing that those who exercise more are more likely to keep body fat off long term. So it helps with maintaining that weight loss. But compared to, for example, diet, the benefits are going to be very modest. You have to burn a lot and do a lot to create those deficits where it's very easy to, it's hard to burn 300 calories. It's very easy to eat that back, a slice of pizza, two beers, whatever it is. So the benefits are modest. However, they we do see small benefits. And I think the reason you're asking the video I reacted to the other day where someone was saying, exercise is pointless and actually can make you fatter because
Mhm.
then the appetite is worse afterwards. And as you say, you kind of eat all of that back. And it's like, well, that is clearly false. And I think the impacts that it have on appetite, I think also it tends to be more in people like acutely. So people when they start exercising, they might get
Mhm.
more of those issues with hunger. Whereas if you're more habituated, you've been exercising a long time, I think it's probably going to be less likely to increase your hunger to any significant degree. But it can do so. However, the interesting thing is that it increases satiation. So when you do eat, then
Mhm.
you are those sort of appetite signals are more sensitive and better. So then people will probably be better with their portion control. So I think that overall it may, depending on the type of exercise you do. And again, this is one that when you're looking at research, we're looking at what happens to most people. It doesn't mean that it's going to apply to every single person in this case. Some people might find their appetite increases significantly after certain types of exercise, and that's the other thing as well. It does depend on the type of exercise you do, right? I think that, for example, like high intensity or weight training, that's not necessarily going to do so much, but some people might report that their hunger is much worse when they're doing more endurance-based stuff, lifts, that type of thing. And that's personally for me, that's where I would feel that.
Mhm.
I know when I've gone through stages of doing more that type of thing, then my hunger does go through the roof temporarily when I first start. But yeah, I think that no, to the point of sort of ruining anything you've done through the exercise. That's the answer. Would be
I
my
always
answer.
think there's a couple things. Now, as you said, and I love this, the outcome data is what ultimately dictates.
Mhm.
But at least on a mechanism level, anecdotally, there's two things that I think apply here. If you are comparatively more active and spending more of your time exercising, well, what's that probably coming away from? Probably down leisure time that might be associated with the trigger, stimulus to response relationship of snacking in front of a television, right? So it simply is potentially interrupting the amount of time you might be otherwise eating. And I think the big one that we always see is when people start exercising, they tend to, as a byproduct, naturally start thinking about eating healthier food anyway. Now, that's a double-edged sword because invariably those people, if they fall off the activity side of things, they tend to fall back in the other nutritional habits. So again, it's
Yeah.
pros and cons there. But at least from my experience, I think those two things play in. And I still think that exercising is overwhelmingly net positive. And to your point, I think that acutely some people might experience hunger. And again, I absolutely do think it's the type of intensity of the exercise. But I just like people being mindful of it. But my
Yeah,
my
for sure. I think
my
you're
data
expending more
agrees with
energy.
you.
You're probably going to want to consume more as well, but I don't think that yeah, you're gonna sort of undo everything you've done. But and also it's funny you mentioned that because I see this all the time as well with clients, just anecdotally. If people can't follow one side of the equation, if they can't follow the diet, then they fall off the training. If they can't follow the training, they do that. But actually, it makes the other more important when you're not doing the other one, right? Like if you're not exercising, you're not expending as much
Mm.
energy. It becomes even more important to be a little bit more on it with your nutrition, but it's just not mentally how it works for a lot of people, and that is something that I work with um, clients on like all of the time.
And you allude to something really important there about the fueling. And if someone really cares about this, I have a great episode with Dr. Susan Kleiner. She's a brilliant PhD with sports performance nutrition. And if someone is engaged in a lot of high level activity, and the episode, it biases more towards women than men because socio-culturally, women on average, very careful to say that, tend to face more of that dual pressure to both perform and to look a certain way than men culturally. So a lot of times women can be at risk of underfueling relative to the demands for their sport. So if you're increasing your activity, and definitely if you're in athletic pursuits, just making sure you're adequately fueled is important. If anybody wants that episode, DM me personally. I will send you the episode with Susan Kleiner or just scroll. It's fantastic.
Mhm.
There's another post you had that I liked. Why can restricting calories early on a day with a special occasion later sometimes backfire? Because a lot of coaches, we tend to think, oh, well, in order to create room for you to go and enjoy this wedding or birthday party or something, we'll just eat less during the day. It seems like classic and intuitive advice, but why does it backfire?
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong for everyone. I think that it can, calorie banking is, as it's often called, can work quite well if you know you have, you're going out for dinner, as you say, you're gonna have a couple of drinks, and you want to sort of, I suppose, save those calories or that allotted energy for later. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but you do have to do it in the right way. I think the issue is a lot of people can overly restrict throughout the day. They'll really try to eat as little as possible. And then they're obviously going to be ravenous when they get to that meal or whatever it is they're doing. And it makes good decisions really, really difficult. And again, to highlight, just to emphasize, one meal out, even if it is, going over your calories or something, like it's very rarely problematic. It's if this is happening quite frequently. And a lot of people I work with are quite social and they're going out quite a lot. So I think that what I normally recommend is, in a way, the opposite, in some ways not. So adding more food in, but just making sure that it's the right types of foods early in the day. So things that are going to keep you full. So you're not skipping meals, you're not starving yourself, you're making sure there's plenty of fiber, plenty of protein with those meals. Maybe even adding in a snack before you go, something high protein. It could be as simple as a protein shake, or some fruit, or combining the two, protein and fiber before you go. So when you go, you can actually make more sensible decisions. And in a way, it helps people enjoy it a little bit more because they're a little bit more present and not wolfing it down because they're absolutely starving and they're making a decision like, well, I can actually slow down and enjoy this meal. So that's normally what I recommend with people, especially because a lot of people who are trying to manage their weight are they really struggle with this sort of binge restrict cycle and mindset, which this only feeds into. So I think there's nothing wrong with eating more sensibly, in air quotes, around these sorts of meals or social events, but just making sure you are still fueling yourself, making sure you're not going starving, you're hydrated, you've had a decent amount of protein and vegetables and stuff throughout the day or closer to the event. I think that works quite well for people.
Well, it's funny because you think about it. And we as an industry will tell people for the special occasion, oh, eat less earlier in the day. But meanwhile, on an everyday basis, we have people do exactly what you described. They're not eating enough the early part of the day. They're ravenous later, and their eating decisions tend to be poor, and they tend to overconsume on high calorie food. Well, why is why are we telling for an everyday situation people to eat more early to fill them up so that way they're not hungry and at a risk of a binge later, but give them the opposite advice for a special occasion, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we actually have a lot of data showing that people who eat more energy earlier in the day, so if they front load their calories and food, they tend to eat less overall and have better appetite regulation. So it's the old saying, it's like eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper, or something like that. It's like a very old saying, but it's funny because we have like actually a lot of data now coming out showing that eating more throughout the earlier parts of the day might be more effective. And again, it's going to be individual. Some people just don't like having breakfast and things like that, and that's also fine. So you just got to experiment and see what works for you.
Sounds like a very British euphemism. And by the
Yeah.
way, and I've made this joke before on various forms of media, but the cheat code to social media success in North America is a British accent or an Australian accent or something very adjacent to it. Sounds similar. So
Most of my
we
audience is based in the US, actually. So
does not shock me whatsoever. Like it is an absolute cheat code. Okay, we got time for one more thing. Fiber. I mean, it feels weird to even think that this is controversial, but we still have people out there saying that there are no benefits to fiber. Fiber is bad. Like, holy shit. Okay, rip that bullshit apart.
Yeah, I mean, a common thing I have and a sort of idea that I see promoted all the time is that fiber is pointless and not beneficial because your body can't digest it properly, which is actually funny because that's precisely why it's good for us in some ways. So, for example, fiber acts like a sponge for bile acids, which are made up from cholesterol, which then means that it helps the body to excrete them instead of recycling them, which means your liver has to then use more cholesterol to make new bile acids, which then lowers your circulating LDL cholesterol. Obviously, touched on why that's important. It also helps speed up the removal of waste and harmful substances from your colon, lowering your risk of certain types of cancers. It feeds your gut bacteria. When they're well fed, they're going to produce things like short chain, excuse me, short chain fatty acids, which is good for your gut microbiome and your immune system. It also is going to help with appetite management, slowing down digestion, slowing down the digestion, absorption of sugars, therefore helping with appetite control and weight management. So the reasons that it's not necessarily digested like other foods is actually why it's so good for us. And I think that some people can experience things like GI issues or gas or bloating when they start to increase it massively, and they think that that automatically means, oh, my body is telling me that it's bad, but not necessarily means you might just be increasing it too fast or in a way that you're not used to.
And that could also be, if I understand it correctly, explained. Let's say if someone has had a diet rich in ultra processed foods, certainly a lot of refined sugar, and not a lot of fruits and vegetables, and then they make a shift. Well, your gut microbiota is
Mhm.
influenced by what you're eating, so therefore a major shift can create some of these issues. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that, as you say, that can be true for many different types of foods, but I think fiber in particular. But once you're sort of acclimatized to it, I suppose, it shouldn't really be too much of an issue.
Good. And FODMAP issues can also be present here too. If let's say someone suddenly brings in, or they've been
Mhm.
consuming something for a long time, they've got a low grade intolerance to, and that can cause gastrointestinal distress as well. And
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
very tricky to actually identify, pinpoint what within that FODMAP spectrum
Mhm.
might be causing the issues.
Yeah, if someone's going to do that, they'll want to do that under the supervision of a dietitian. We actually went through that as part of my master's, and
Hmm.
it's funny. It's you can imagine how practically that's a really difficult process to go through and to sort of narrow down what people might be reacting to. But yeah, for sure, I would probably recommend someone works with a specialist, specialist if that's something they need to do.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and a service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps eating out. That costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes. And this has come up in other episodes before, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but what are the reasons why people might start a carnivore diet and suddenly feel better and then have the false equivalency that this is healthier and this is healthier for everybody, because that's some grand leaps in logic. It may be simply that there's something in their everyday diet that they would normally think is healthy, doesn't agree with them. FODMAP issues again being the case, you've removed it, all of a sudden, whoa, I feel better. So in its best form, if someone's determined to try a carnivore diet and they feel better initially, treat it like an elimination diet and then start bringing shit back in. And if you identify this one thing as a problem, well, maybe just take that out, not all the fruits and veggies.
For sure, I think that's one of the benefits to it, but and that's the excuse that I see the sort of proponents or big promoters or accounts of carnivore will use that as an excuse eventually anyway after a couple of years. Oh, it was just a short-term experiment. When they start feeling bad from it because they felt good initially, they start having problems, and then they don't want to, they've accumulated this cult-like following, and they're like, no, I'm just like experimenting and adding small bits of fruit in. And I made a joke video about this the other week because it nearly always happens.
And in no way, shape, or form am I endorsing carnivore diets. I'm comfortably on record to say is I think that once we get more data, downstream as people do these longer, we're going to see some really scary stuff. So I don't endorse. Everybody can follow you on Instagram at Luke Hanna, Hannaa. There's no second H.
Yeah.
Nutrition. So again, at Luke Hanna Nutrition. Is there anywhere else you want to send people?
No, that's it. It's the same for all platforms. So, yeah.
I think your nuance, knowledge, the way you broke all this down speaks for itself, guys. Please go follow Luke, and hopefully you'll enjoy more of his media. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate everybody.